Welcome everybody to this very, very special 5x15 event. I just wanted to say a few quick words before we get started. We're so honored to be joined tonight by Carlo Rovelli and Neil Gaiman, two superstar storytellers from across the arts and sciences, for this, which is their first event together. And we are really honored to be hosting it and to be celebrating Carlo's beautiful new collection of essays, which is called There Are Places in the World Where Rules Are Less Important Than Kindness, and it is out now. So I hope everyone will have a chance to pick up a copy if you haven't already. And I wanted to flag just two of Neil's incredible books, which are recently out, Pirate Stew, which is for children, and the Neil Gaiman Reader, which is out now for adults. And please put your questions in the Q&A box. I know we're going to try and get to as many as we can in the next hour. And Erica Wagner, who is our host and chair this evening, will be trying to get to as many as she can. But forgive us if we don't get to all of them. So now I want to introduce Erica. She's a widely acclaimed critic and an author herself. She's written a number of books, including a biography of Washington Roebling, which is called Chief Engineer. And she was the literary editor of The Times for 17 years. And she is now a literary contributing editor at Harper's Bazaar and an editor at The New Statesman, and she writes for many, many publications and has been a judge of the Booker Prize twice. So we are really honored to have Erica with us, and I will disappear into the virtual wings and I will hand over to her. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Daisy, and I am really thrilled to be here this evening for this absolutely one-of-a-kind 5x15 event, when we will be addressing with two extraordinary authorities some of the really big questions. We will be breaking down barriers and crossing boundaries, asking, how does literature nourish science? When does physics become poetry? As Carlo Rovelli writes, this is the nature of culture, an endless dialogue that enriches us by continuing to feed on experiences, knowledge, and above all, exchanges. So without further ado, let me introduce our fantastic panelists, Carlo Rovelli and Neil Gaiman. Carlo is a theoretical physicist who has made significant contributions to the physics of space and time. He has worked in Italy and has joked that, like Copernicus, he was an undergraduate at Bologna and a graduate at Padua and the US, and is currently directing the Quantum Gravity Research Group of the Centre de Physique Théorique in Marseille, France. His books, 7 Brief Lessons on Physics, Reality is Not What It Seems, and The Order of Time, are international bestsellers, which have been translated into 41 languages. Last year, he was included by the Foreign Policy magazine in the list of the 100 most influential global thinkers, and no wonder. His imaginative rigor, his lively humor, and his beautiful writing are inspiring. He challenges us to think in new ways, and this kind of thinking is necessary, especially now, I dare say. Science is constantly learning something new, he wrote not long ago, and more often than not, such learning means jettisoning wrong ideas. That is why science often clashes with common sense. Our intuition wants Earth to be flat and still, and time to be the same everywhere. None of this is true, he writes. His new collection of essays has a wonderful title. There are places in the world where rules are less important than kindness. It's published by Alan Lane, and in March, Alan Lane will publish Helgoland, a book which aims to reframe how we think about quantum physics, making sense of the quantum revolution. And if we're lucky, we might get a little sneak preview tonight of that work and its ideas. Conversing with him is the wonderful Neil Gaiman, my old friend, one of literature's great polymaths. His books are published for children and adults and everywhere in between. He is the first author to have won both the Carnegie and Newbery medals for the same work, The Graveyard Book, A Transatlantic Triumph. His work has been adapted for film, television, radio, and is, to me, distinguished by its ability to adapt to these new forms while somehow always remaining itself. I love the film of Coraline, released in 2009, as much as I love the wonderful 2002 book, and that's a rare distinction. American Gods and Good Omens have become major television series, and he has of course written 2 episodes of Doctor Who, including The Doctor's Wife, a particularly stunning episode, I think. He and I should say, collaborated some years ago because he is, like me, an admirer of the fantasy author Alan Garner, and I was delighted to include him in First Light, the 2016 celebration of Garner, which I edited and which was published by Unbound. This winter season, he has 2 new books out, as Daisy said. For children, the terrific Pirate Stew, created with his frequent collaborator, Chris Riddell, and published by Bloomsbury. And there is also the Neil Gaiman Reader, the perfect introduction, out for adults and published by Headline in the UK. And if we were live, I have to say, I would encourage you all to give a tremendous round of applause for these 2 extraordinary people, writers, scientists, everything, but I know you are doing that virtually. So welcome to both of you. And I'm really, really thrilled to be in this dialogue with you. I want to start by asking really how you are and how you have been during, I know it's a complicated question, during these past remarkable and difficult 8 months. Carlo, can I turn to you?
Thank you. And thank you for this introduction, flattering and embarrassing for me. You're very kind. It's a difficult question how I've been in this difficult period, because there's a sort of guilt for me answering. I see the disasters, I see the people dying, I see the sadness and the economical difficulties of many people. But personally, for me, it has not been hard. In fact, I found myself in places where I was not supposed to be for a long time. I decided not to move because I think not traveling is a good idea. And I stayed home a lot, and I didn't have direct economical weight like many people had. And so it was an easy period for me. In fact, a nice period, because staying at home, reading, writing, it's my dream life in a sense. I was afraid of dying, like many people. I mean, at some point I thought, well, I mean, I could die. This could be my end. So it has also been a moment of reflection about mortality. I think for many people it has. I mean, we'll die, and we know, but we never think about that. And this year, I think we have talked about that more than usual. We have been confronting the weakness of our society, the fragility that we didn't expect, but also the fragility of our life that we knew about, but we didn't want to think about.
Absolutely. And Neil, how about you?
Well, I wound up by a series of, I was going to say mischances. It's not exactly mischances. But I've wound up spending the last 9 months on the Isle of Skye in Western Scotland in my house here. And while I normally, I've had this house since 2005, and I normally get to come, work, have a great time, and then bop off and do whatever it is that I'm meant to be doing around the world. I've never had 9 months here just to walk the hills, walk the coast, watch the change of light, watch the strange difference between June the 21st, when I was out at 11 p.m. taking photographs of the sunset, and now as I sit and work and I watch this small sun like a silver coin just sort of rising not very far and traveling not very far across the sky and then vanishing in a little blaze of pink and being gone. And I've become more and more obsessed with time and with stones. part of the obsession was starting to grow anyway, because I was starting to realize that anywhere around here that there are stones where there shouldn't just be stones, somebody put them there. And sometimes they put them there 500 years ago, and sometimes they put them there 4,000 years ago. And I've been talking to some archaeologists literally round the corner from where I'm living, who now have evidence of 14,000 years of people turning up and leaving stones and chipping. And I think I'm probably going to, I'm in that weird place that I get into when I know that 6 months from now or 5 years from now, there is books or stories or something brewing. And all I know is that the part of my brain that makes up stories isn't quite letting the rest of me know what's going on. But it seems to be a thing. And it seems to be very much. So that's been wonderful. Everything else has been strangely terrible, except that I keep thinking that no work has been done and that time is being eaten and going through in some kind of weird speeded up mode. But actually an awful lot is getting done. So there. So that's me.
I think that, and I'm going to ask, I think we've all had our, we've all had to a greater or lesser degree, our perceptions of time altered in this period. But actually what Neil says now, Carlo, makes me want to turn kind of right away to Neil, to me, is kind of describing, I want to say, almost a process of fermentation, when artistic ideas start to bubble away without consciousness quite. You've talked about, in a way, I'd say your kind of almost slow start, if I can put it that way, as a scientist. It seems to me that you spent a lot of time finding yourself. How does that thinking process work for you in science when you're working towards an idea?
Ideas take long to appear, and I recognize, Neil, in what you're saying, this the long period in which ideas are sort of floating in a space which is not is sort of pre-born, but they are there already, but they are not realized. They're not. I mean, inventing thing or writing something or getting an idea in science is different. I mean, there are many different ways in which things arrive, of course. But I mean, one of the articles I wrote, the title is "Ideas don't fall from, you don't get them from the blue sky suddenly." There is a long preparation because I think doing something new is going in a place where we have not been, but you don't just jump there. It's just the long staying near to problems, questions, contradictory things, half intuitions, and going around them over and over again, and slowly they start to get some new order, some new. The creativity, I believe, is deeply rooted in the large amount of things we know. And that's the way I think culture works. You have to be able to forget everything, to break everything, to break the rules, to jump in new places. But you cannot do that unless you have a deep knowledge. You build on something. Otherwise, you do some superficial things or wrong things or silly things. One of these days, you mentioned Copernicus in in Italy. And what I was saying in my book, I ask what did Copernicus find in Italy? Copernicus is the greatest revolutionary of all time. I mean, the name revolution comes from the title of his book. For him, it just meant the revolution of the planets around the sun. And then it came to mean a big change, because his book was an incredible change. And I think that in Italy, what he found, it's the spirit of the Italian Renaissance, which was, let's change everything new, plus this centuries of stratified scientific knowledge rooted back in ancient Greece and the Arabs, Ptolemy, Archimedes, and he could absorb all that. And it's a combination of the two things that allowed him to make this big jump. And he published a book 30 years later. For 30 years, he talked about. He was in the same mood as Neil in his island, I mean, playing around with an idea that slowly grows.
I love that line that you quote in the book from that time period, that from the flowers of the past, we make the honey of today. And
Yeah.
the idea of honey of ideas coming from all of these ancient flowers. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's Petrarca. It's one of the great Italian poets of the late Middle Ages. He's one of the inventor of the language, of the Italian language, and his poetry is incredibly new compared to anything before, novel, and yet that's what he says. You get to go to get the honey from the flowers of the past. But Neil, if I may, stones. You've been looking and thinking about stones, and my first answer to Erica was about the fragility and the fleeting aspect of reality in which we're immersed. And stones are perhaps the strongest metaphor of what could be not fleeting. Right, what remains. And in fact, you mentioned even what, 14,000 years ago?
14,000 years.
Remarkable. Why did people move stone around? Why do our ancestors spend time moving? Maybe that's what we do, the same things. And maybe in the future, people will look at that. Why did you do that? But stones are there. A stone is the most long-living thing we can imagine or we can think of. And yet, 14,000 years is long, but those stones will disappear at some point. Right? They're not forever either, they're for long. So I feel that that's the space in which we move, right? Between this permanence that we try to get attached to, stones and cathedrals and pyramids and before, and our even sense of identity of what we do. We write books hoping a little bit that will last more than a few days. But then on the other hand, we know that it's fighting against something we're going to lose, right?
But it's funny when, Neil, when you mentioned stones too, I thought of something, this wonderful idea, the way that you put it, in The Order of Time, Carlo, is, and I wrote it down, the world is not a collection of things. It is a collection of events. The world is made up of networks of kisses, not of stones. I think it's such a wonderful image, and a wonderful image for creativity too. But could you say a little bit more about that, since we've started on stones?
Well, if you think carefully about what a stone is, if we look at it during our life, it's a very permanent thing. And if we look at it with the eyes of an archaeologist, it's a very permanent thing. But suppose we look at it with the eyes of a star who lives for 1 billion years. A stone is just a momentary aggregation of things that then dissolves, because stones dissolve after a while. So a stone is, with all its permanence, is also very impermanent. It's a set of events that stay similar to itself a bit more than usual. And I think that we understand better nature by thinking of these events that interact with one another and for a while stay together creating things and stones, rather than the other way around, thinking of nature as a set of entities, a stone, a mountain, myself, United Kingdom, freedom, which are there. And we relate to these things. I don't think the things are there. I think we are just the combination of these of events which are momentarily. Maybe it's just this year, the pandemic, that is making me so think about fleeting aspect of reality. Of course, stones are very stable, and we like stable things. We love stable things because they give us a sense of stability, because we want to be stable also. We would like not to die.
I've been thinking a lot this year about one of your essays in the physics book, where you talk about time as being, Einstein writing a letter to the widow of a friend, just saying, no, he's absolutely still alive. You guys are absolutely still together, just in a different time. It's not the past, it's all now. And that, weirdly, I found probably not just the most hopeful and helpful thing and way of thinking about what's been going on in the pandemic, but also a way of just thinking about people, trying to understand why these people would have built a stone circle here and a building next to it and another building over there, and going, well, they're still here. They're just, if I could walk 5,000 years, I could sit with them and talk. And as it is, I can at least look at the same kind of sunset that they were looking at and the same kind of sunrise, and at least try and go, oh, well, of course you build this here, because if you stand just here and you look over there, you have that hill that people could have lit a signal fire, and you can light your own signal fire, and people can see you all the way down there. And you've covered, just by being in this one tiny place, you've covered the entire island. But you sort of have to be there and sort of imagine what it would be like just to walk 6,000 years into that place.
This is wonderful. I wish I want to come to that island. I mean, I hope this vaccine get fast, and then I want to walk on this. Look, I love what you say. Let me put it this way. My father died a couple of years ago. He was very old, so it was it was the right moment. You're very old when you get to the end. He was very serene, and at the end was a nice way of going away. And I was not particularly devastated when this happened, because I've been waiting for that, and was the time. So it was, this is a step of life. And then slowly, I realized I keep thinking about him. Somehow the more time passes, the more I think about him. And there is a very concrete sense in which he's very present in me. I talk with him. I listen to what he would say to me. So, and I think that this is not a delusion or something vague. This is very concrete. Namely, I believe that what we are as person, as people, is very much what we are in our network of relations, and what we tell one another, and the way we see one another. And even I think the way we see about ourselves is largely our image reflected in the eyes of others. So our identity, I mean, we are flesh and stuff, but we are much more than flesh and stuff. And the more, it's a lot what we are for one another. So my father is for me there, very, very much there. And the people of 14,000 years ago are still with us, giving sign of us and telling things to us. That's the way I think about ourselves. I don't. Neil, in some of your books, I mean, I read only recently American Gods, where the gods exist to the extent they are believed and adored, and I think it's a wonderful story, of course, but it's also a wonderful reflection of what is it to be real. And I took it not just as a marvelous storytelling, but also as something which is telling us something about reality. Not because we can make us reality the way we want. Of course, we cannot. Just experience of life. I mean, reality is very solid. I mean, you cannot go through a wall by not believing it. But nevertheless, we interact with the reality, and we see it in the way we see through the fact that we see in that way. So reality exists in the way we understand it. Including the gods, of course, including the gods in which people believe, and therefore they exist. That's what the gods are in a deep way. So once again, a stone is not an object out there just by itself that, irrespectively of us, exists through the. It's a network in our reading of reality and in the way we talk to one another.
I like to think of gods as existing to the extent that people behave as if they exist and have power. And it's that thing where you're talking about belief and saying, look, we have gods that we know nothing about. And we have gods that we have old statues of forgotten gods. They have no power. We have other gods who, whether they exist or not, almost doesn't matter, because you have millions, sometimes billions of human beings acting as if they do. So, you know, you're dealing with reality and consensus reality. And of course, Carlo, I mean, the big question for you is what is real?
I think that, well, look, my forthcoming book is about quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is a mess, because the best theory we have about reality, and is a less clear and worse understood theory about reality. If you read in textbook, it's all about you know, what you observe and the observer affecting the system. So it's very confusing. The title of the book is Helgoland. Helgoland is this island in the Northern Sea. It's a very small, teeny island where quantum mechanics was conceived by a 23 years old Werner Heisenberg, who went there because he was suffering from allergy. The island has no trees, but also I believe because he was enamored by pirates. And the island was a hiding place of pirates. And in the northern countries, there is a famous pirate is called Storybrooke, something like that. I forgot. And the young Heisenberg was the kid who was in love with this pirate. So he went to this island alone, and he had this problem about physics. It's not clear how the atoms were working. And he spent some time alone in an island there, walking. The island has big rocks, and doing calculations and reading Goethe. He was in love with Goethe. And suddenly the calculations start to work, and he starts to understand something. And then one night he has this incredible idea, and it works after all this months and years of struggling, and things start working. And at 3 o'clock in the night, he is done, and it works. So his new way of doing calculation, that's the birth of quantum mechanics. That's the greatest scientific revolution ever. So at 3 o'clock at night, he just closes his notebooks, goes out in the night, and there's this immense rock on the island. He climbs the rock, goes on top of the rock, and wait for the sun coming out from the ocean. thinking that he has seen something that nobody else has seen. And that's quantum mechanics. And we're still using, to build this computer or to build nuclear powers or to build medical machines to look inside that. We're still using the technique that this guy, this young kid invented there. And the core of the technique is not thinking that he was thinking about atoms, electrons, not thinking that the electron is a little thing there, but thinking about how the atom, the electron interacts with what is outside. So how things interact with one another, not how things are. So the question, this goes straight to your question, what is real? Real is not what is there by itself. Real is what affects something else. So reality is, I think, that's my reading. That's the way I make sense of quantum mechanics. Reality is the network of the way things affect one another. Of course, including all sorts of things, including big things, complicated things, our brain, our thinking, our society, our collective deliriums, everything. I don't think there is a bottom line behind that. The final, physics for a while dreamed, okay, we have seen the end. The end is just a space with particle moving and nothing else. No, things are much more complicated than that.
Well, that for me, I think that's what I love about all of your writing about science, is it always comes back to people and people interacting with other people and people interacting with their world. And it's so easy to think about people as equations, physics as numbers and rules. And yet the place where it all comes to life is the point where you start going, no, there are people interacting with their world who dreamed up these rules, who discovered these rules, who broke other rules or negotiated with other rules. I love, some of the first essay in the book, where you're talking about Aristotle moving to Newton, moving to Einstein, and as if, and saying it's not actually as if this year's physics came out and we threw away last year's physics, or we threw away the volume that we've been using for the previous 2,000 years and going, actually, this is all bullshit. Here is where we started really figuring it out. And then, oh, no, in the 1930s, 1920s, we had to do it again and it's reissued. It feels so much more like a process of observation, continuous people observing, continuously people recording, communicating, interacting. And the feeling that good science is, that you're always going to have a guy who's had a brilliant vision sitting on a rock, looking out to see as the sun comes up, going, I've figured out stuff that nobody else has done. But it is fundamentally communal because other people metaphorically built and directed that rock, and it is that rock that he's climbed. It is, you cannot get to Newton or to Galileo without Aristotle. You cannot get to Einstein without his predecessors. And they understood that, and they are people. And that peopleness is the place where it all comes alive for me.
And I was going to say too, when Carla was talking about that atoms exist, and you can stop me if I am getting this wrong, but that all these things exist in relationship to each other. That to me also, when I think about your work, Neil, that's the heart of storytelling. Storytelling is about how people, events, they don't exist in vacuums. They interact with each other. That's the motor of every story.
there is a sort of the what comes next and the why should we care. And why should we care always winds up at the end of the day coming down to human beings. Or to things that we have created that feel human enough or feel enough like us that we can recognize something of ourselves in what they do and how they behave. But that for me is, I think, just the sheer delight of creating story is, and especially I'm feeling that right now, especially feeling at the beginning of a story, feeling like, okay, I have no idea who the human beings are in this story other than they cover a longer time span than normal. And in order for the story to be real and work, none of them can be particularly long-lived. So now I have to figure out how to tell a story that covers 14,000 years with a lot of characters that still feels like the same story. And I love the fact that the first thing that my head is doing is just building the problems, in the same way that when I was writing the Graveyard book, I had a place and I had a set of problems, which were, I want to do this as short stories set about 2 years apart, and there need to be about 8 of them, and it still has to amount to a novel at the end. You have to get to the end and go, this was a novel, even though you were reading it and it felt like short stories on the way. And so you're starting out with the problem solving thing, which actually isn't, none of that is going to be the stuff that people remember. None of that is going to be the stuff people will take away from it is the, crying at the end of the book, cheering when something cool happens, falling in love with a character, being frustrated that 2 characters didn't end up together. That's what the people will care about. That's what they'll always remember. But that's almost like the byproduct of the problem solving thing that you're doing, in perhaps the same way that, bombs that destroy lives wind up as a byproduct of somebody trying to figure out why atoms and electrons behave as they do.
I want to just introduce, because we have questions coming in from the audience, and so I want to drop a couple of them in. And here is one from Terry Pierce, which is for both of you. And the question is for Carlo: what fiction or fictional worlds resonate best with your scientific concerns or passions? And then we will ask Neil what scientific ideas inspire your fiction most. I'm going to say we should take it as read that each other's work is inspiring. So outside of that, Carlo, can I turn to you first?
I don't have a direct answer, because I think that it's one of the the point you mentioned at the beginning. I think that science has always been strongly influenced by all the cultural universe in which it lives, including philosophy, including literature. So I think that I've been inspired in thinking at large about physical problems by reading literature all my life. I read an enormous amount of literature all my life, especially classics. I mean, I always say that my taste in literature is very boring. I like what everybody likes. I like the kind of things you study at school. I like Dostoevsky and Goethe. I love Shakespeare and Neil Gaiman. So really the greatest. It's not something specific that inspires me. The complexity of reality, which is reflected in literature, because that's what literature does. It tells stories It's the beauty of the stories, all these things Neil talk about, but it's also always also enlarging the way we think about things. Right? You read Shakespeare, and then you think about human being differently than before. You have a more richness of things, of possibilities, of behavior, of relations, of connection, of stuff. You've seen new things. That has been inspiring me precisely because it shows that reality is rich and complex. And if we stay with a worldview, we're trapped there. We always want a little bit some else. So from Dante to Homer, there is always a little bit more that we add to our view of reality. And of course, as humans, I mean, Neil is completely right. We always bring it back to humans, but as a scientist at the same time, and I think this enriches the story. Humans are just a piece of this immense complexity, which is reality, which of course are particularly of interest to us because we are one of them. But the universe is not part of us, is we are part of the universe. And we are just floating in this immense reality as one of the little things around. And I like thinking this way. And there's a lot of literature that feels that. We are part of this story. Neil, if somebody asked me, when would you like to time travel? I always thought that my answer would have been something like 20,000 years ago.
I'd love to be 20,000 years ago. And I also wonder a lot about how to communicate, not how to speak, not a language thing, but the feeling that the people 20,000 years ago probably aren't seeing the same world that I'm seeing, and how to exchange information. Even if you magically gave us the same language, I suspect that we would be talking about, thinking about, perceiving different things and completely different worlds. But yes, I think I'm especially here with my current stone obsession.
That's right.
I've been thinking about that so much. Just, okay, here, going up to there's a little stone circle on the hill, and I went up with an archaeologist the other day. We're just sort of looking at the one standing stone, which is the one in the middle, which is oriented perfectly east-west. So on the solstice, it would have done something, and noticing that there was one, it had a sort of stone built into it on the east side. And I said, well, what? It looks like it's actually for something. And my archaeologist said, well, yes, that's where you'd put the animal or the baby or the child. And when the sun hits it, that's where you would cut their throat. And then there was a pause. And then she said, I don't know why I said that. That went very dark. And I thought, it went very, very dark and feels terribly right. But the idea of, much like Alan Garner, that thing where you just feel like, okay, there are the bones of the earth are sticking out here. Some of the bones of old time are here, and it's not necessarily the way that we would have wanted it to be. It's much more what it was, and we don't understand that, and we never really will.
Wonderful, yeah.
I think, sorry,
Maybe say one thing. We are far more complex than what we think we are.
I was just going to say, in the what scientific books, 30-something years ago, Terry Pratchett said to me, he said, Neil, what you have to understand is, as a writer of fiction, you will never get inspiration from fiction. You've read all the fiction, you've seen the movies, you've seen the TV. That's not where you're going to go, now I can tell a completely original story. He said, you'll find those in things like, reading a book on how they fed Nelson's Navy, whatever. That's suddenly where you'll go, oh, well, then there's a story, of course. And so for me, I've been a reader for the last 30-something years of anybody explaining stuff I don't understand to me. And that can be the Oliver Sackses, and more recently David Eagleman, those people who are going, the brain is absolutely terra incognita, and we don't understand things, but what we know is this. It can be the actual people whose job it is to try and explain science to people like me who go, I have no idea what you're talking about, but I love you and I like the way you say it. And then there's also the thing that I'm doing a lot right now, which is getting utterly obsessed with bad science. And by bad science, I mean, I'm reading things like, I've got a copy of the giant 12-volume edition of Fraser's Golden Bough here. And I've got Robert Graves's The White Goddess. And I'm going, none of it's true. And even when it's true, none of it means what they thought it meant. And it's actually telling me more about what it was to be a middle-aged, white, important, moneyed person writing a book or writing about poetry. But that doesn't mean there is no information there, and it doesn't mean the information is valueless. It means there's an awful lot to learn. It's just not what they thought they were telling you. And that fascinates me.
But I think it's interesting you bring up the topic of bad science, Neil, because I was going to ask Carlo. I think my sense is, I was listening to the New York Times' daily podcast today about the development of the vaccine against COVID, which is coming along incredibly quickly, as these things normally happen. But it seems to me, as an observer, a non-scientific observer, that we are in quite a perilous moment for science and for the acceptance of scientific fact. There's a lot of discussion around this vaccine, whether people will take it at all. The anti-vax movement is growing, and you write, there's an essay in this book about UNESCO and traditional medicine. So I wonder what you can say, Carlo, to addressing this abandonment, I want to say, surprising abandonment in belief in scientific fact as it can be ascertained.
It's a difficult topic because it's a political topic. So let me try to say something not obvious, two things. One is that, of course, everybody knows what you're talking about, and this enormous amount of people that reject competence and facts, simply facts that we know, our knowledge, in a way which is factually stupid because it's harming to themselves and everybody else. But the question is posed, ill-posed, because if they do so, they have a reason. And I think it's a political and economical reason. Most people who do that are people who are de facto really underfavored in a society which was based on competence and left people out. Focused on some weak people, but not on other weak people. So they have a reason, which it's then turned around, is expressed in a completely wrong way. And I think if we address that reason, I mean, we are not in a perfect society. We're in a society in which an exaggerated amount of inequality, in which a lot of people in many countries, in many super rich countries, have a very poor life, a very miserable life. And it's these people who don't believe experts. Maybe they have something they're trying to say. And I think that of course, society can only work if there is a common body of accepted truth, which is debated, discussed, but then we work around this, which can evolve, of course, can change, can evolve, but it's a, but for this to happen, you need people to come along with society. If people don't feel they're coming along with society because they see a lot of rich people around, I mean, this rich intellectual like us saying interesting and like things, but they are having a bad life, why should they come along? Why should they buy the common story? Now, I understand that the alternative stories which they buy are silly and stupid de facto. I mean, and harming for everybody, including the people who follow these ideas. But just telling one another how they are wrong and telling them how they are wrong, it's to me the wrong point. There is inequality, there is injustice, there is people unhappy in this society, and it doesn't matter how they express it. The point is that they're unhappy. And I think if the part of society in power doesn't recognize that and doesn't address their needs, the breaking of the social conversation which we see around us is going to continue. Now, of course, there's a lot. The second point is that you know, why people don't believe science, because I feel bad, because all my life I've told everybody, think with your own head. Now I'm past 60, I think I'm older, and I would like to tell people, no, don't think with your own head. First study and learn, and then think with your own head, because knowledge without rebellion it just goes to death. But rebellion without knowledge, it just goes to danger, to silly dangers, and goes nowhere.
That's a very interesting point. I wondered, Neil, how much, because I think of your work as steeped in both knowledge and rebelliousness. Is that something that resonates with you?
Can I interject? Neil is a quintessential combination of rebelliousness and knowledge. I mean, because it's not only he breaks, he says things that you're not supposed to say very often. But what he does, and the incredible power, one of the powers that nourishes his stories is precisely his sort of vast knowledge of what is in the history of human ideas, which emerge and come out, and is rearranged in his own. So it's a quintessential combination of deep knowledge of what the humankind conversation has produced and rearranging, redoing.
Thank you. When I was 11 or 12, I had a lisp and was sent to an elocution teacher who, bless her little heart, did not actually teach elocution. She taught me, she didn't do it approach it as speech therapy. She just decided to teach me how to talk and how to act and all of that kind of stuff. And I remember doing something for her, a Puck speech from Midsummer Night's Dream. And when it was over, she said, "Neil, dear, before you can be properly eccentric, you have to know where the circle is." And I took that as a huge piece of adult wisdom. There's absolutely nothing wrong with being eccentric. There's nothing wrong with leaving the circle. There is nothing wrong with plunging out on your own and doing it your way. but it's always a good idea to know how to do it their way first, and to know what the wisdom is, and to know if you're breaking rules, to have a reasonably good idea of what the rules are that you're breaking. And I think that's always going to be true, because that way we build, we break and we build. There's no, there can't be creation without destroying something that went before, or at least moving it around or rearranging it. From a one of the things I'm always reminded of reading Carlo is that at the end of the day, death is just a rearrangement of atoms. That everything's still around. In that beautiful Carl Sagan line, "We are stardust," and we just get rearranged.
You mentioned that because we are astonishingly, I have to say, the hour has flown by. We are coming to the end of our time, I'm dismayed to say. But I think at the beginning, I want to come back to Neil. You were talking about the final essay in Carlo's book, which brings us into the present that we're in, and in a sense is about hope. And I want to ask you both, in this time that we're in, as we're moving into the darker days of the year, but spring is coming, what gives you both hope? What do you focus on and look for in your artistic and scientific selves? Neil.
Actually, you and I were talking about that essay before this talk began. So let me just put a little context into that for those people who weren't listening to us before we started. The final essay in Carlo's wonderful book was written a couple of months into the pandemic, and it's written from an Italian point of view, talking about what is going on in the world, about the deaths, about what's happening, and then pulling back, and not pulling back in a way that feels like Carlo is minimizing the death or the disaster, but just moving further back, moving further away from the world, looking at things from a viewpoint of more time and more space, and going, yes, but they're people and they will die, and this is an epidemic, it's a pandemic, and they do end, and life will go on, and we're not going to be back where we began, but we will be somewhere else, and we are people. What gives me hope in all of this is the idea of community. What gives me hope is people working together to build things rather than tear them down. People working together to fix, people doing things, whether it's nurses, whether it's people working on vaccines, whether it's just people figuring out how to do their lives in a way that does no harm to other people while we get through this. And it is hugely moving. It makes me feel proud to be part of a giant species of people who can make things, and make things that weren't before. I'm always reminded, and especially with my giant stone obsession, just that we may think of ourselves as loners, we may think of ourselves as individuals, but at the end of the day, if you drop a solitary human with no clothes or tools or knowledge of human history and the things that we've made into a place, you would probably wind up relatively soon with a dead human being. What allows us to survive, what gives us a world with books and artificial flickering candles and weird ring lights and microphones, and all of this is the knowledge and the enthusiasm and the desire to make things better, or just to make things new, of other human beings. And I love that we get to live in that world where everybody has contributed something to us being here and where we are.
Thank you, Neil. Carlo.
Essentially, what gives me hope is the same thing that Neil just mentioned. I think that it's a dark winter we are going into right now. A lot of people are going to die, and there are tensions all over. Plus, global warming is coming, ecological catastrophe is coming. The future is not going to be easy. But first of all, and that's somehow my consideration, precisely because we are facing all that, we see how precious is life, and we're happy to live this life in its best. And second, and most importantly, what gives me hope is seeing so many young people. I mean, I'm old now, but so many young people that do think that a better world is possible, a better reality is possible, and a world in which the basic rule is let me do better than the others, let me have more money than the other, let my country be above the other, let my country be more powerful than the other, let my group be. It's not the only possible world. We, as Neil said, humankind has done everything that's done. We have this beautiful life because we collaborated. And this pandemic is such a common problem for humankind altogether that it's completely obvious that the solution can only be global, collaboration is needed. And I think a lot of young people are seeing that, and are seeing that what we want is not a world in which we are fighting to be the more powerful, but a world in which we're fighting to be the one who contribute best to everybody's advantage. And when I'm optimistic, which is a couple of days a week, I hope that we're going in that direction.
Well, I think that's just a wonderful note to end on. I want to thank you both so much for a remarkable evening. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Carlo. Thank you to 5x15. I'm going to also thank our wonderful audience out there. I wish I could see you, but I'm also glad, not wanting to be a Pollyanna, but we have Neil in the Isle of Skye. I am in London, England. Carlo is in London, Ontario, and we're all able still to come together in this way. I want to commend to you, of course, Carlo's new book, There Are Places in the World Where Rules Are Less Important Than Kindness. It's published by Alan Lane, and his new book, Helgoland, is coming in the spring. And 2 books from Neil, Pirate Stew, and there is also the compendious Neil Gaiman Reader, which is a marvelous tome, I have to say, for the devotee or someone who needs to be introduced to his work. So thank you both so much. Thank you, 5x15. I'm Erica, and it's been wonderful being with you tonight. Good night, all.
Thank you very much, Erica. And hello to everybody. Thank you very much,
Thank
Neil.
you, everybody.